Hello and welcome. I'm Paterno S. Makel, and this is Rappler Talk. Saturday, September 11 is the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks that changed the world forever. With us today is one of the world's terror experts, also the CEO of Rappler, Maria Ressa. Thank you for sitting down for this interview, Maria.
Good to see you again, Paterna. Thanks for having me.
Maria, it's been 2 decades. Can you transport us back to the time when 9/11 happened? Where were you? What do you remember? How did you feel at the time, Maria?
It was evening, and I was in Jakarta. I was on exercising. It was around 6:30 to 8:30 at night, and I was on a treadmill and looking at the monitor, watching the news. And then when I saw the plane crash into the building, I thought that's got to be a movie, and I switched channels, and then and then I realized it was CNN, right? And I saw it was the World Trade Center. My sister works downtown. My mother used to work in the World Trade Center, so my parents worked in New York. So at that point, I was like, "Holy crap!" And then I remembered when the second plane crashed. It was a memory. There was a 1995 interrogation report that I had in the closet in Jakarta of probably the very first pilot recruited by the group we would later know as Al Qaeda, right? And the man's name was Abdul Hakim Murad. He was arrested here in the Philippines, connected to a plot to assassinate the Pope and Bill Clinton. But he said these things, and I pulled them out of the box I had. Right? He said that they were going to crash planes, hijack planes, and crash them into buildings. And then he named the buildings: the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, the Trans America Building in San Francisco, and then some another building in Chicago. And at that point, I picked up the phone and called Atlanta because I was like, "You have to send me back to Manila."
Maria, you wrote two books about terrorism, and one of these books is this book, From Bin Laden to Facebook. And in these books, you recounted how the story of 9/11 for you did not really start just on September 11, 2001, but way back in 1995. And you, as a journalist, covered it, Maria. Can you tell us about your experience covering what your one of your books said described as seeds of terror?
I think this is one of the things that is both exciting and difficult about journalism is because as you cover the story, you have no idea that what that's only the tip of the iceberg. You have no idea what else it was hiding. In 1995, I was covering this for CNN. I was doing live shots and I knew that someone had been arrested, and I even knew it was the Doña Josefa apartments, but I didn't know until much later that that man that had been arrested was connected to the guy who tried to bring down the World Trade Center in 1993, and his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who would later become the mastermind of 9/11. Right? This was Ramzi Youssef, who was in the Philippines. So Ramzi Youssef, that pilot, Abdul Hakim Murad, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. These men lived in the Philippines, were here in 1994. They tested these tactics. 9/11 was like ripping a veil and opening Pandora's box for me because I had all of these interrogation reports from these men that I didn't really understand nor really believe uh, until after 9/11 happened. And then you go back and you look at it with different lenses.
And Maria, the Doña Josefa apartment, the what the police saw there, the investigators saw there, they stumbled upon these things by accident only, right? In your
Correct.
documentary for ABS-CBN, like a decade ago, uh, you reported that it was just a fire, right? There was a fire in Doña Josefa apartment, and then they saw all of these evidence pointing to the plot to assassinate the Pope. Can you tell us about it? Because many of our viewers aren't aware of what happened uh, years before 9/11. We just to give us a background of where it really came from.
Wow. So, I mean, if you go back really, and this is where Seeds of Terror began, it was in Afghanistan. And it's interesting that right now we're going back to Afghanistan, right? It was in the training camps in Afghanistan where these militants, we would call them militants then, were trained, and then they went off and dispersed in every country, in different countries around the world, including Indonesia, including the Philippines. And in 1994, there was a small cell. So the beginning of it was always the money, follow the money. Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law, Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, had begun setting up charities in the Philippines. And then these men who were in the Doña Josefa apartments were actually there to begin to carry out the plots already. By that point, by 1994, they had already gone through airport security. They had tested the shoe bomber, right? He was Ramzi Youssef, the guy who did the truck bombing in the World Trade Center in 1993. Ramzi Youssef actually tested airport security in Manila, and he carried out a successful midair explosion on Philippine Airlines in 1994. And that would later be repeated, or they would try to repeat it, by a guy named Richard Reed. He was nicknamed the Shoe Bomber, and he'd try it again in 2001. Lots of other things. Anyway, so here we are in 1995. They're mixing the explosives. Wali Khan, Amin Shah, sorry, these are like old friends now, right? All these men are now in maximum security prison in the United States. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, well, he's dead. Ramzi Youssef, um, Wali Khan, Amin Shah, and Abdul Hakim Murad. When they found the pipe bombs, it was a woman police officer who actually they could have gotten away, but she came back, and he one of the guys tried to bribe her to let him go, and she refused. She actually arrested him, and I went to her several times over the years because she never got the recognition, uh, but she did the right thing, and all it took was that one person to prevent the plots from happening. But here's the other thing: 9/11 was only one part. Oplan Bujinka, which was the entire plot, actually called for 10 airplanes. And after 9/11, after that happened, they began to see that it had already been deployed, and they began to actually arrest these would-be hijackers, terrorists. One of the places where they met was in a high-rise apartment in Malaysia. So you had, look, it's no coincidence that every major Al Qaeda attack since from 1993 to 2003 had some link to the Philippines, right? So you start with the attack on the World Trade Center in 93, the 1995 Oplan Bajinka, that was the plot to bomb US airplanes over Asia, the 1998 bombings of US embassies in East Africa, the attack on the USS Cole in 2000, the 9/11 attacks, the plot to truck bomb US embassies and Western interests in Southeast Asia in 2002. That was discovered by Singapore. And then the Bali blasts, which I also covered, that was in 2002 as well. And the JW Marriott hotel attack in Jakarta in 2003, that was, both of those were very close to my apartment in Jakarta. So it's incredible how much was tested, planned, and then operationalized by a very small group of men.
Maria, how does it feel to have been a journalist who covered the 1995 Bojinka plot, and that you were on a treadmill in Jakarta and 9/11 happened? And yeah, how did it feel?
Shock. You know, I was shocked at how little we exposed in 1995, how little we took seriously. And I guess that was part of the reason I became a much tougher reporter after that, because I had these documents, but they just sounded like ramblings, right? Like you couldn't take them seriously. Well, people's imaginations
Mhm.
are serious. So I went back to Manila. Avelino Razon was talking, and then also at that point, Bobby Tiglao was the spokesman, and it was actually Bobby Tiglao who confirmed, based on their intelligence, the other buildings that were targeted at that time. I went and got that story out to CNN, and to give you an idea of how fraught it was, it took a week to go through our legal processes, and Kelly Arena, who was doing that from the Department of Justice in the US, was getting the FBI. But I think the key part for us is, as we are doing today, accountability. If
Mhm.
this intelligence report was already with the United States, how could we have missed these signals? I think that was the question, and I it's the same question that I asked myself as a journalist. How could I have missed this? And I think that's part of things happen in plain sight is the other lesson I learned, right? And one of the a few of the sources were actually the women who were the girlfriends of these three men here. I went to their apartments. In one lived in Ortigas, very near our office. So it became real in a whole other way. And then the last part I remembered, because I was living in Jakarta at that time, and so much of the training, Indonesia was the theater of operations, and the training camps had been moved inside MILF camps in the Philippines, which the MILF always denied, but were there. They finally actually said that this was happening. I think what was shocking to me is how we took these things for granted, right? How the world changed. The post Cold War world, we thought it would be a far more peaceful world. Democracy would spread. Um, it This led to, uh, what we would call asymmetrical warfare. When nation states are so powerful, uh, people like Osama bin Laden was able to hijack homegrown groups in each of our countries and unite them in a jihad against the Western powers.
Maria, 9/11 is a story of so much human suffering, and of course, human suffering is always relatable. But aside from human suffering, the question, the topic of human suffering, why does 9/11 matter to us in Southeast Asia and in the Philippines in particular?
I think it's another indication of how interconnected the world is. Why did they test airport security in Manila's airports? Because we were using American security companies, right? Number one. Number two, this is there are two big stories in my career where the Philippines was the testing ground to find tactics, terrorist tactics, that would then be used against the main target, which was America. The first is 9/11. The second is online, right? The disinformation attacks, the influence information operations. Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Christopher Wiley called the Philippines the petri dish. And this is a place, they said, he had told us, where um, Cambridge Analytica, before it was called Cambridge Analytica, was testing tactics of manipulation. If it worked with us, then they ported it over and they targeted the West, targeted America. So that was interesting to me, right? That shows me two things. I think that shows me that our systems are lax. We may have modernity, we may have the same systems as the West, but our accountability isn't there. And the second part is, we can be far more vigilant, right? To go back, the world is connected. And our problem is, in disinformation operations today, for example, I call them the new terrorists, um, is that our systems are far weaker. Our institutions are weaker. So while America can get through this, and it did, and its institutions are a bit stronger than ours, our institutions crumbled in a far shorter period of time.
Maria, what's the most important lesson we learned about terrorism after 9/11?
So I'll tell you how journalists, how we attacked it first, right? After 9/11, we began to look at, there's the devastation, almost 3,000 people killed in one shot, the iconic landmark, the attack. This is the same thing of death by a thousand cuts, right? I use that phrase, and it is a phrase from Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, from Inspire magazine, where they said we will attack the West with death by a thousand cuts. Small attacks. Well, that was a later strategy after the authorities came after them. What 9/11 showed us is, after you deal with the horrific impact of this kind of symbolic tear down from the mountain caves of Afghanistan, you then look um, at how the world shifted, um, and that in the end, these tactics are global in scope. Right? I think that's a lesson I pull out of these two instances in the last 20 years
Mhm.
where the Philippines was a testing ground, right? If anything, what it shows us is how similar people are and how interconnected we are. After we focused on the destruction, the we then looked at the terrorists themselves, the radicalization of people, how people can be manipulated. I was particularly obsessed with this because, I was trying to track down what would make a young man put on a suicide bomb and kill himself. You know, the Philippines was one of the last countries to have a suicide bomber, and in a strange way, I took a kind of perverse pride in that we had at least that we weren't having suicide bombers. But so after you look at the terrorists, so the individual, the radicalization of the individual, we then realize that individuals behave differently when they're in groups. How does
Mhm.
radicalization happen? Well, in groups, peer pressure changes the way you would behave. So after groups, then what happens when it's large groups with these kinds of inspirational attacks? That's what it was meant to do, to inspire other jihadists. Well, bring it now to our fights with influence operations, and you'll see the same exact tactics because you're talking about social networks, right? So um, after 9/11, we saw that people get radicalized, and this would be
Mhm.
the same in Marawi, in small groups, first in person, and then around 2014, the radicalization moved online on social media. In fact, the Philippines was one of the first ones where we had a Filipino jihadi go on YouTube in 2011 and
Mhm.
in Arabic ask jihadists to come to the Philippines for jihad, right? So that's when it moved to online. That's where ISIS also, as the forces globally were able to tear down the leaders, the top and middle rank leaders, the threat evolved. And what happened was that they then needed to, it's like the internet, more and more of less and less. They needed to go to the lower rung operatives. And at the same time, you realize that the internet has now made it far more complicated. Uh, and while Yeah, it's far more complicated, Paterno. I'll shut up because I find this just
Yeah.
so fascinating, the way they intersect with each other.
Do you think, Maria, governments have learned their lesson after 9/11?
Depends what lesson you are looking at. So I would say after 9/11, 9/11 changed the post Cold War world and changed security paradigms of
Mm.
every major nation around the world, right? All of us, including the Philippines, was still using the Cold War kind of global security paradigm. 9/11 changed that. And then, you know, Al Qaeda was actually quite successful in changing airport security, changing things that were fundamental to the way life moved. Um, but I would say that one of the other things we've learned, this asymmetrical warfare, is now that you have let's fast forward to 2021, where you have more than 80 countries around the world where cheap armies on social media are rolling back democracy. You now have governments using the tactics of asymmetrical warfare against its citizens. I don't know whether that, I again, the easy answer to your question is yes. What the world learned post 9/11 is that security forces around the world needed to cooperate, that no man is an island, that they needed to work together. And that was, part of the power of the reporting I did for CNN was that in Southeast Asia, intelligence was not centralized. In the Philippines, intelligence was not centralized. So you could go to any agent and ask for a copy of their intelligence report, and there wouldn't be a central repository. Well, all of that changed after 9/11. But I would say far worse than that is that this is a threat that will never end. And as long as a government doesn't give its people what it needs, and we're actually in a place and time where it's far more difficult to do that, as long as people are disenfranchised, you know, the ideology of terrorism, different types, will have an appeal. And then I'll add the one part. I joke all the time that my new terrorists are these disinformation networks that are attempting to manipulate what we believe. This radicalization moves beyond terrorism to daily life, to politics. So power and money becomes a driving force to manipulate us. That's tough. It's a far tougher world in that sense.
Maria, for the benefit of our viewers, what's the connection between this enfranchisement of citizens and terrorism?
Let's talk Marawi, right? And why the family went there, right? So for maybe a decade after 9/11, I was able to, what I did as a reporter was to really pull the string and do a network map. The FBI and the Philippine authorities used to call it link analysis. That was when we began doing that, because we would pull person by person. And part of the reason CNN and ABS and then Rappler, part of the reason we could report that, these brothers, for example, are part of the network is because we did a network analysis.
Mhm.
The core of recruits is disenfranchisement. And
Mhm.
that is part of the reason you have this in our poorest provinces, right? The base, and it's deeply intertwined with something I also had to deal with, kidnap for ransom, a whole cottage industry that's also intertwined. In the southern Philippines, you don't have card carrying members of these groups, of the Abu Sayyaf, of the MNLF, of the MILF, right? Why are these groups? What's happened over the decades is that, the MNLF was the umbrella group. The Philippine government negotiated peace with that larger one. Then the MILF splintered. The MILF had connections to Jemaah Islamiyah, which is Al Qaeda's arm in Southeast Asia. The Philippine government negotiated a peace agreement with the MILF. And
Mhm.
then you have the Abu Sayyaf, which is designated a terrorist organization. Where do they recruit? They recruit among the poorest of the poor who have nothing to live for, who need to provide for their families. I always used to say when I was just doing terrorism research in the Philippines, the problem of terrorism could be solved with good governance. Part of the reason that these recruits go to these groups is that if you're a young man in Holo and you don't join an armed group or a private army, you and your family are vulnerable. So this is connected. Terrorism is not something on its own. Terrorism is a byproduct of government's inability to give people what they need.
Maria, you're talking now about governments, and I'd like to go back to your point a while ago where you said governments are using asymmetrical warfare against its own citizens. And earlier in our interview, you connected asymmetrical warfare to the terrorists of 9/11. So, are we in effect saying that governments are using the tactics of the 9/11 terrorists against its own citizens, and why?
Let me connect it. The one thing that I jumped to without really explaining is why online information operations is like asymmetrical warfare, right? Um, part of part of what online the information operations, there are two phrases for it: information operations or influence operations. The first time we really heard about this was when it was included into the Russian military doctrine. It's been there for a long time. It's called desinformatia, and it was always, I guess, most of the world powers, if you think Russia and the United States, they use this as soft power. It's propaganda. Online, though, on Twitter, on Facebook, it becomes exponential. And what the governments did who are using this, and Russian disinformation has already been proven. We ourselves have linked the disinformation networks in the Philippines to the alt right in Canada, to the Russian information ecosystem, right? So Russia, China, last year, Facebook took down a Chinese influence operation from China, attacking me and Rappler. It was also creating fake accounts using AI generated photos for the US presidential elections. And it was campaigning for Sara Duterte in the Philippines, right? These are Chinese influence operations. What it shows is that, it's insidious, it's death by a thousand cuts. It isn't one thing, and it isn't in your face. It isn't an arena where, like the old style warfare, two armies face off against each other. In asymmetrical warfare, you have maybe a far weaker opponent, but they come at it like guerrilla warfare. Uh, Now that our government's using it, this is so I'm still trying to figure this out, Paterno. And part of the reason I'm so fascinated by what we are living through now is that it actually, these are our tax pesos that are being used against us. And how do we deal with that? And here's the second part is how most people don't even know they're being manipulated or that they're being attacked because these are far more sophisticated propaganda tactics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we're just interested to know more about what do you find in common between uh, 9/11 and you mentioned many contemporary problems. For example, disinformation. We're facing disinformation, populist leaders, and I know you've written much about it, and you've mentioned these in your speeches. What are the things we find in common between these problems for the past 20 years, Maria?
I've been saying this also a lot recently. I think it's power and money. It goes back to this, right? So after 9/11, you had this kind of people in the United States and other parts of the world. There was a reaction against Muslims. uh, this was not never about religion. And it was actually a Philippine official, and she's still around today. But at that point, she was the former Philippine Immigration Commissioner. This is Andrea Domingo. It was her group that actually first found the links to the the 9/11 terrorists, right? Because they were still here in the Philippines. Um, she told me this, and this is a direct quote. She said that their goal is world domination. They
Hmm.
are using religion as the battle cry. They're using religion as the battle cry. So think about that post 9/11, right? And then I put it together with Benazir Bhutto from Pakistan, who gave me that paradigm of Osama bin Laden tapping different youths in different regions by pegging it as a war between Islam and the West. But what he was actually doing was damaging the regional conflicts for his own agenda, which was to seize power for himself, right? What is happening now? Well, this is a way of actually taking a democracy and through a thousand cuts consolidate power. It is still about power and money. These are just different tactics of how you can do that. I think the difference now is that you don't need a plane to carry out a terrorist attack. And we know this, right? Some of the biggest problems right now, as early as 2014, former ambassador, US Ambassador John Negroponte actually said that the biggest problem that we will face globally are cybersecurity issues. And I was asking him to rank it along with North Korea, right? So these are all interconnected. We have a pretty complex world, and ultimately, at the core, are how human beings can be manipulated and what we believe.
Maria, your what you said at the start of an interview was pretty striking for me because I think it resonates in our times now. What you said about you as a journalist having covered this years back, and then suddenly you see it exploding before your very eyes, and then you remember that you covered this disinformation, the rise of populist leaders, the abuses of Facebook. You have warned this, many times in the past, and that might have been the Bujinka moment for you. Now we are seeing the 9/11 of our days, the explode, the attacks on democracy, and you are here again as a journalist, no longer on a treadmill, but you are seeing it right before your very eyes. How do you feel about this, and what can we do?
I think, wow, it's such a complex question, Paterna. I love it. Um, what it showed me is I, as a reporter, I felt the horror. I felt like Sisyphus rolling the rock up the hill because we've been raising the alarm since 2016. What happened in the United States on January 6th, the attack on the Capitol, not a surprise because we've lived through this. I had that same thing happen. The very first time that happened was, Bali, the attacks in Bali in October 2002, because we were seeing the signals already. If you're a reporter following this, you could see it. Bali was not a surprise. Um, so what I, I I'm writing a book right now, and one of the things that I realized was that these acceptance speeches that I wrote in 2018 are still as relevant today as they were then, and their solutions, right? Which is now more than at any other time, you actually have to be aware of the facts. You are very easily manipulated. So the time to fight for the world you live in, for the rights you have, is right now. The time to fight for journalism, for our Constitution, the Philippines of your kids, that's right now. And I said that in 2018, right? 2017, 2018. Don't stay quiet when you're attacked because these exponential lies become facts. This is the same thing that the terrorists used. It just took longer with social media. It's viral faster. Um, Third point was we have to continue reporting without fear or favor far more than at any other time in the last 30 years or so that I've been a journalist. This is it. And a former colleague, Christian Amanpour, actually said that. She said, we need to be truthful, not neutral. We need to be truthful, not neutral. Because when everything is being politicized, you need to tell people what they need in order to be able to make the right decisions going forward. And then I guess the last part is, and this is the same after 9/11 as it is today, you constantly have to look at the world with new lenses. And I think the reason I stay hopeful is because I do believe people are basically good. We're basically good. So, you know, walk a mile, walk a kilometer in someone else's shoes, especially now when we're isolated and alone in our homes. And I would make that appeal to the authorities who actually have the power to to make the right choices for how to manage the COVID response.
Maria, you said that people are basically good, but when faced by a disaster, a terror attack like 9/11, it's hard to see things like that. As a
It
journalist at that time, 20 years ago, where did you see that ray of hope? Can you remember a face? Can you remember an event? Any small thing that gave you hope and gave you energy at that time, Maria?
so many, so many, right? That's the, I mean, from my family in, my mom and my sister, my mom walked across the bridge in order to get home, and people helped her. And uh, look, these times demand leadership. And it's very sad for me that some of the leadership post 9/11 has been tainted. Fast forward to today, right? But it was the leadership that carried Americans through it. In Indonesia, which is where I was living at that point in time, it was a very inclusive leadership that it could, Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim population, could have just attacked and said, it's your fault. But the outpouring of humanity, of empathy from that time, I remember that as well. And that's also leadership, right? I think people act in inhumane ways when they are threatened or when they're afraid. And what leaders should be doing is leading us out of those valleys of fear and bringing us together and reminding us that the only way we conquer these catastrophes are to come together. That's the part, right? And now I sound like I sound like a Hallmark card, but it's not. That's really what I've learned. And Paterno, you're also an optimistic person. There is something more, which is why leadership is so essential.
Maria, this morning you posted on Facebook about what you said a while ago in the interview. You remembered your family, your parents walking the streets of New York. Why does that surface in your memory? Why is that important for you as you remember 9/11?
I think because, well, there are actually two different things, right? As a reporter during that time period, I lived at a time when you couldn't talk about it. It was wrong for me to talk about my family at that point in time, right? I couldn't say that then. And today we live in an environment where that part is part of what we post. I don't know whether that's good or bad. I mean, there was something, I do miss the old days every now and then. um, but I think that here's what we take, right? Imagine if we can take our family and friends, which is always the regionalism of the Philippines, our family and friends, instead of just thinking about them, to enlarge family and friends to more people. So that's the way we're going to get through this, especially during a time of COVID. This isn't going to go away anytime soon. Um, but the last thing I'll say in answer to that question is really the problem of where do we get facts? On Facebook, if I were to have just posted the facts, almost 3,000 people killed, and I would put them in a row, right? Just facts. 20 years ago, this much. I saw, for example, one of our former CNNers post like an hour's video of the CNN newsroom uh, right when the planes had crashed and how the process of journalism worked. Well, I put that today in this online world. That's not the way it works anymore. And that scares me. So I guess that your question makes me think about both the implication for facts, the distribution of facts, which social media now is, Facebook is now the world's largest distributor of news, and what it prioritizes. We need facts in order to create a shared reality and find solutions to the world's problems. If we don't have those facts, it will get worse.
Maria, just winding down. You mentioned a while ago that The one thing that connects 9/11 to the problems of today and perhaps throughout human history is power and money. And the worst of the human condition would bring us to the abuses of power and money, abuse of power, impunity, and abuse the greed connected to money. Now, in the face of all these negative things, where do you draw hope?
At the worst of times for me, from Rapplers, from actually here, I have the ultimate faith in Filipinos that our values have not changed. We're one of the first signatories to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Um, I draw hope that we will remember that, and that we will remember that if we stay silent while someone does something wrong in front of us, that we become complicit. Um, I draw hope and energy from the fact that whatever we do now is is actually critical. We're creating what journalism will become. Filipinos watching, Filipinos helping build a community pantry. That was incredibly inspiring, right? I don't think Filipinos have changed. And so that's what I draw hope from. I think that fear has a great effect, but I think when we conquer fear, far more inspirational is actually the people. Filipinos are inspirational. The community pantry is just the most recent example of that, but I believe that that well is there and that needs to be opened.
9/11 was a horrible story of death and destruction, but as you said a while ago, we believe that humans are basically good and good will triumph over evil. Thank you very much, Maria, for joining us. I'm Paterno S. Makel. Thank you for joining us on Rappler Talk. See you again next time.